Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the moment a single decision, made not in rage, not in pride, but in quiet, trembling clarity, can shape the legacy of a person for generations. You'll never believe it, but one of the youngest congresswomen in modern US history once gave up her political safety net in the name of something no one could measure, her dignity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Post your location and what time it is right now. I want to know where you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get started tonight. Jasmine Crockett wasn't born into power. She wasn't handed a legacy, a dynasty, or a backdoor pass into the halls of Congress. She earned it, one long night at a time, fighting case by case as a public defender in Texas, choosing the hard cases, the hopeless ones, the ones everyone else lets slip through the cracks. She didn't just talk about justice, she lived in it. And it tired her bones. By the time she arrived in Washington, people expected her to adjust. They expected the fire to dim. You know that old saying, when you get to the table, don't flip it? Well, Jasmine sat down, but the wood felt rotten, the air stale, something wasn't right. Her first few months were a whirlwind of meetings, policy briefings, and handshakes with smiles that didn't always reach the eyes. She played the game, or at least tried to. She wore the heels, straightened her back, and measured her words. But no matter how hard she played along, there was this quiet, growing ache inside her, a whisper that said, "This isn't who you are." Then came the vote. Not a headline-grabbing, viral video kind of moment. Just a regular bill. Something seemingly harmless, buried deep in legislative language, disguised like so many things are in D.C. But Jasmine read the fine print, and what she saw made her stomach twist. It was a bill that would harm the very people she had sworn to protect. Her district, her community, her story. A clause that would limit housing access, couched in language about efficiency. A little line about reforming enforcement that really meant making it easier to jail the same people she once defended, and every voice around her, staffers, colleagues, mentors, told her the same thing. Don't fight this. It's a small thing. You're new. You'll get your chance later. They meant well, or maybe they didn't. Either way, Jasmine smiled, nodded, walked out of that meeting, and stared at herself in the Capitol restroom mirror for a long, quiet minute. The kind of minute that stretches into hours in your soul. She knew she had a choice. Play along, keep the seat warm, and maybe one day be rewarded with a committee chair. Or vote no, stand alone. Risk being labeled difficult, disruptive, ungrateful. Words that cling harder when you're a young black woman in power. But Jasmine Crockett didn't run for Congress to be liked. She didn't run to be comfortable. She ran because she believed some things were too sacred to compromise, like the dignity of the people who trusted her. And so she voted no, no fanfare, no cameras, just a quiet, steady voice in a loud, restless room. That single vote, over something most Americans never even heard about, was her line in the sand. That night, she walked home alone in the rain. And it didn't feel like losing. It felt like remembering. Because sometimes choosing dignity means choosing to be uncomfortable for a long, long time. Thousands of miles away on a different continent, under a hot, heavy sky. Another story was unfolding, one that seemed so far from the polished halls of Washington that it might have belonged to another world entirely. Burkina Faso had been quietly bleeding for years. The world barely noticed, but the people did. The streets whispered of promises broken, of governments that bent too easily, and of lives lived in the margins. The kind of lives that don't make global headlines until everything falls apart. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't born into politics either. He didn't grow up dreaming of power. He was a soldier trained to follow commands. But more importantly, he was a listener, listening not just to the radio, not just to generals, but to the voices of his neighbors, his family, his country's tired heartbeat. And what he heard was pain. The people were exhausted. Schools were closing. Farmlands were turning to dust. Extremist violence moved like a shadow in the night, claiming villages, burning futures. And through it all, leadership remained silent, or worse, complicit. Traoré watched his comrades die, not just from bullets, but from bureaucracy, from betrayal. Every funeral made the silence louder. Until one day, something in him snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. It wasn't a dramatic coup with gold medals and grand speeches. It was a decision made in the quiet of a tent, under flickering lights, after too many nights of sleepless watch. He turned to his fellow officers and said, in essence, "We cannot wait for someone else to do what needs to be done." He was just 34. No one thought someone that young could lead a nation. But revolutions don't wait for birthdays. They wait for courage. Within days, the power structure of Burkina Faso tilted. The headlines called it a coup. But on the streets, many people called it a beginning. Women wept. Men stood straighter. Children, for the first time in years, asked questions about the future without fear in their voices. What drove Ibrahim wasn't a thirst for power. It was a refusal to keep walking in circles. He didn't wear suits. He didn't give speeches that danced around truth. He walked among his people with a posture that said, "We're in this together." And here's the beautiful, painful part. He didn't promise miracles. He promised effort, transparency, the truth, even when it hurt. That was his version of dignity. Back in Washington, Jasmine had never heard his name. Not yet. But across the ocean, the energy of his choice, the decision to reject comfort, even safety, for something greater, was echoing. It's funny how one person's whisper of defiance can travel so far that it eventually becomes someone else's thunder. Ibrahim Traoré didn't set out to be a hero. He just couldn't stomach silence anymore. And in that, he and Jasmine were already walking the same road, even if they hadn't seen each other's faces. Because no matter where you are in the world, there comes a time when the only way forward is to refuse to wait. You ever notice how the world has a way of telling you to sit down, especially when you start standing up? Too tall. That's what hit Jasmine Crockett next. After that one quiet no vote, the chill didn't come all at once. It came slowly, an invitation not returned, a phone call left hanging, a meeting that ended just a bit too soon. She wasn't being punished outright, not exactly, just forgotten. A little more each week, people started whispering about her. She's uncooperative, too principled, hard to work with. All the words that get used when someone makes people nervous by telling the truth. But Jasmine had seen this playbook before. She grew up in a world where black women who spoke too clearly were told they were angry, where folks who asked hard questions were told they were ungrateful. She knew the tone. She'd heard it all her life. And now it was following her into the halls of Congress. One afternoon, walking through the marble tunnel that connects the Capitol offices, Jasmine passed a group of colleagues. They looked away. Not cruelly, just politely, like they didn't want to be associated with the noise she represented, like her dignity might rub off and stain their comfort. That night, she sat in her apartment, lights off, TV muted, just silence. You know that kind of silence, the one that feels heavier than sound. She scrolled through her emails. Nothing from leadership, nothing from the press. But a single message stood out. A handwritten letter, scanned and sent from her team in Dallas. From a grandmother in South Oak Cliff. It read, "You don't know me, but I watched you on the floor last week. My grandson is 16. He says he wants to be like you now. Thank you." That was it. No donation, no praise, just a thank you from someone who saw her. And that right there, that's the moment dignity becomes louder than applause. That's when you realize the world will always reward you for being quiet, until the people who need you the most remind you why you ever spoke up in the first place. Around the same time, across the ocean, Ibrahim Traoré was getting his own lesson in backlash. Western media started painting him with a different brush. Military strongman, populist, risk to stability. They never asked why he did what he did, they just assumed he wanted control. But like Jasmine, he wasn't trying to play the game. He was rewriting the rules. And that made people uncomfortable. Back in Burkina Faso, he began walking village to village, listening to the elders, asking farmers what they needed, asking mothers what they feared. No cameras, no script, just presence. Because leadership, he believed, wasn't about being seen, it was about seeing others. The parallels grew louder. Both Jasmine and Ibrahim had walked into systems that expected obedience. They responded with clarity. Both were told to sit down. They stood taller, not because they enjoyed defiance, but because dignity, once awakened, refuses to shrink. The beautiful part? Neither of them expected a reward. They weren't waiting for applause. They were waiting for something quieter, something steadier, change. And if you've ever stood alone, if you've ever spoken when your voice trembled, if you've ever lost a seat at a table just to keep your soul, then maybe you already know what that feels like. The world tells you to sit down, but something deeper tells you, if you sit now, you may never stand again. The strange thing about fire is how it spreads, quietly at first, unnoticed, until it finds something else ready to burn. In D.C., Jasmine Crockett's steady resistance had begun to spark small changes. A few staffers from other offices started stopping her in the halls, whispering support. "I saw what you said. Thank you for saying it." These weren't dramatic endorsements, just flickers. But flickers grow. And something in her was changing too. She no longer sought approval, she sought alignment. If a vote didn't sit right with her conscience, she didn't wait for permission to oppose it. She'd learned that clarity is a better compass than consensus. Then came the panel hearing. It wasn't supposed to be anything big, just another day of legislative oversight. But the room was tense. A senior official was being grilled on a policy that would disproportionately impact poor communities of color. Jasmine waited her turn. When the microphone switched on, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't rant. She asked questions, pointed, specific, impossible to deflect questions. Her words didn't just challenge, they revealed, layer by layer, exposing where the power was hiding. And people noticed. The clip went viral, but not for the usual reasons. Not because she clapped back or embarrassed someone, but because she spoke like someone who knew she might not get another chance. And while her voice traveled across screens halfway around the world, a different kind of fire was taking shape. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré was making choices that no one expected. He didn't consolidate power in his name. He opened doors to community leaders, youth groups, activists, even farmers. He created forums where people could talk to the government directly. In a place where people were used to being told, he asked. It wasn't perfect. There were tensions. External forces pulled, pressured, threatened. He was accused of being naive, too young, too idealistic. But he kept showing up. That's what leadership looked like to him, showing up even when you're tired, even when you're scared. Word began to spread, not just in Africa, but globally. A young captain who listened, a congresswoman who questioned. Two very different worlds, but the same rhythm underneath, truth before comfort. Somehow, people started connecting the dots. In Texas, Jasmine heard from international reporters asking if she had thoughts on the rise of young African leaders. In Ouagadougou, young students printed her quotes on flyers. It wasn't about celebrity, it was resonance. The idea that two people, one from the dirt roads of West Africa, one from the courthouse corridors of America, could walk parallel paths without ever meeting and still share the same battle cry. We will not trade our dignity for your approval. And in that, something profound was taking shape. Not a movement, not yet, but a memory in the making. A story being written by two people who refused to bend, whose voices, though shaped by different histories, began to echo in unison. Two voices, one flame, a reminder that truth travels and courage is contagious, even across oceans, because when one person stands with clarity, another finds the strength to stand too. And eventually you realize you were never standing alone after all. And then came the moment that would define her. A high-stakes vote loomed in the House, one that had global eyes watching. It was wrapped in national security language, all dressed up in diplomacy, but Jasmine Crockett read between the lines. The bill was a wolf in legislative clothing. It gave money and military aid to an ally with a questionable human rights record, while cutting social funding back home. The trade was clear: war over welfare. The pressure was unbearable. Party leaders called her. Mentors visited her office. Donors hinted, gently but firmly. This vote matters, they said. This is not the time to complicate things. The subtext was clear: choose your seat, not your soul. This time it wasn't a quiet bill buried in paperwork. This was loud, televised, historic. Whatever she chose would be on record forever. She didn't sleep the night before. Her mind turned over every angle, the districts that needed her, the future campaigns she might lose, the smear ads that could follow, and something else. The faces of the people who couldn't be in that chamber with her, the mothers who wrote her letters, the students who waited outside her office just to take a selfie, the families in East Texas who had given up hope until they saw her rise. And then she thought of him, Ibrahim Traoré. She'd read about him now, not in a deep dive profile, but in passing articles, opinion pieces, whispers among the few paying attention. A young African leader who had chosen his people over foreign influence, who had rejected the comforts of power to walk among his own, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, but did it anyway. And in that moment she realized dignity doesn't scale, it doesn't rise and fall with votes or headlines. It's not a trending topic. It's a quiet decision made in the stillness of one's chest. She walked onto the floor of Congress. Cameras rolled. Whispers floated across the aisles. She cast her vote. Number. There was no applause, not in the chamber, at least. But outside, people began to take notice. Activist groups released statements. Young organizers shared clips of her speech. Elders in her district called her one of the real ones. Her office was flooded with thank you notes, not from Washington, but from places often ignored by Washington. The fallout came swiftly, invitations rescinded, a major donor pulled funding, a political commentator called her reckless. But that night, as she left the Capitol building, Jasmine Crockett felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness, not silence, not exhaustion, stillness, because she had chosen not strategically, but truthfully. And somewhere in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowd of farmers and students, holding no script. His voice was calm. He spoke not of glory, but of sacrifice. He reminded them that true power doesn't come from a title, it comes from being willing to lose it all. Neither of them knew they had inspired each other, but that's the power of dignity. It moves like wind, quiet, invisible, but it leaves nothing unchanged. So if you're sitting in a room tonight, wondering if standing for what's right is worth it, remember Jasmine, remember Ibrahim. The world may not reward your courage, but it will remember it. So what do we take from all this? Two people, worlds apart, neither bred for glory, each quietly making choices that rippled through history. Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman who refused to trade conscience for comfort. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who laid down personal safety to lift his country from despair. They never met, they never coordinated, but they walked the same path. And what made their path special wasn't the outcome, it was the choice. See, the world will always try to convince you to be reasonable, to wait, to sit quietly and build your turn. And sometimes that makes sense, but sometimes that reasonable voice is just fear wearing a fancy suit. When Jasmine stood alone in a marble chamber and said no to something everyone else had already accepted, she wasn't making a grand gesture. She was protecting the invisible, the people without lobbyists, without hashtags, without power. When Ibrahim left the barracks and chose to lead, not with fists but with listening, he didn't become a hero, he became a mirror showing his people who they could be. Dignity is expensive. It costs friendships, security, opportunities. But it buys something that cannot be measured, alignment between your soul and your steps. So ask yourself, where in your life have you stayed silent because it was easier? What part of you is still waiting for permission to speak? Tonight, maybe the lesson is this. When the world tells you to sit down, it's not because your voice is unimportant. It's because it's powerful. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to rise. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment where choosing integrity meant losing something else? Share your story. Let others read it and feel less alone. And if this story made you think, inspired you, or even just gave you something to feel, subscribe to the channel. That support keeps us going, and it means the world.